Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take a huge stack of source material articles, histories, research papers, and we boil it all down into the most essential kind of mind-bending insights you need.
Giving you that knowledge shortcut.
Exactly. And for those of you who have been following the WhyItTV Nike series, think of this as the final layer, the definitive analysis.
It is.
Today, we are not just looking at athletic gear. I mean, we are really dissecting a decades-long cultural movement, a corporate empire, and a competitive playbook that, it fundamentally rewrote the rules of modern sports commerce.
That's absolutely right. Our goal today is a really comprehensive, deep exploration of Nike. We're going to trace its path from, a wild idea hatched by a recent graduate all the way to its current status as this cultural and economic leviathan.
And we're covering everything.
Everything. Its origins, the whole evolution of its corporate ethics, which is a huge story.
Oh, yeah.
Its groundbreaking product innovation, which literally got sports rules changed. And the intense competitive environment it had to conquer, especially against rivals like Reebok.
And the source material it's extensive. We're talking Phil Knight's original business concept, the legal arguments around carbon fiber plates and racing shoes, the surprising political division from their recent marketing.
Right.
And yes, the genuinely shocking and gruesome origin of the most famous slogan in advertising history.
And the mission here, for you, our listener, is to get past that superficial brand story and really understand the deep strategic principle that has guided Nike for decades. We're calling it the outcomes of outcomes philosophy.
It's a simple idea, but it's so profound. How does a small, high-risk decision like, say, the choice to cover a basketball player's fine up, how does that create a global ripple effect that doesn't just bump sales?
It's much bigger than that.
It secures decades of market dominance and literally defines modern athletic consumption. That is what we're here to unpack. We want to understand the consequences of the consequences.
Precisely. We need to trace how a company's choices transformed from just simple business metrics, revenue, hitting KPIs, into these enduring cultural assets, into community building, and as we'll see occasionally, into these huge global ethical crises that required profound organizational change.
So let's start at the very beginning, the foundation. The history section of our material takes us back to the early 1960s. This was a time when, most serious runners were in these heavy leather shoes made by German companies. And then along comes Blue Ribbon Sports.
The genesis of what became Nike is, it's really rooted in Phil Knight's 1962 thesis. He wrote it while he was getting his MBA at Stanford.
Okay.
And the core concept he was looking at was the Japanese economic miracle, specifically how Japanese car manufacturers were starting to penetrate the American market.
Right, offering high quality, but at a much lower cost than the American and European competition.
Exactly. And so Knight wondered, could that same model be applied to specialized athletic footwear? If he could import high-quality, low-cost Japanese shoes, he could completely disrupt this established, kind of complacent, German-dominated market.
It's just fascinating to think that this colossal American cultural brand began with the simple disruptive idea of importing Asian shoes.
It wasn't even a product idea, really.
No, it was a distribution and pricing model idea. He borrowed $50 from his dad, went to Japan, and he secured a deal with the Onitsuka Tiger Company to import their running shoes.
And that immediately led to the critical founding partnership with his former track coach at the University of Oregon, Bill Bowerman.
And Bowerman was the product guy.
The genius product guy. He was obsessed with innovation, constantly cutting up shoes, experimenting with new designs, just to get a little bit more performance for his athletes.
So the sources detail this first delivery of 300 Tiger shoes. It arrives in 1964. Knight stores them in his dad's basement and just starts selling them out of the trunk of his car.
His green Plymouth Valiant.
And this is where we really have to pause and emphasize the sheer scale of that early struggle. Because when you look at the corporate behemoth Nike is today, it's almost impossible to imagine that the company, Blue Ribbon Sports, was perpetually on the verge of bankruptcy for almost 2 decades.
It was not an overnight success story, not at all.
Right.
The struggle was persistent, it was brutal. They were constantly fighting with the Japanese manufacturer who often failed to deliver on time, forcing Knight to just scramble for capital, for new suppliers. It was a fight for survival year after year.
Just constant cash flow problems.
Constant and intense competition in what was then a very niche market.
But this early turbulence, the source material argues, this is what solidified Knight's core philosophy, both about business and about life. He viewed the pursuit of this crazy idea, this calling, as just absolutely paramount despite all the risks.
He really believed in meaningful work, and crucially, he reframed what failure meant. Knight openly admitted they made constant mistakes, but he insisted that failure was just an opportunity to gain wisdom.
An intangible asset.
Exactly. He believed this accumulated wisdom was a critical asset that their competitors, who hadn't gone through this kind of trench warfare, simply didn't have. Those 20 years of just grinding it out prepared them for the high-stakes competition that was just around the corner.
And that persistence finally paid off in a huge way in 1980 when the company decided to go public.
That was the financial inflection point.
Yeah.
The IPO resulted in what the sources call astounding success. It instantly turned Phil Knight into a multimillionaire worth $178 million basically overnight.
Wow.
And that event established the fiscal machine that could finally move past those early decades of hand-to-mouth survival. They had the capital to innovate and, crucially, to absorb risks. And that trait would define their entire future strategy.
They needed that fiscal machine because the second they moved past that initial struggle, they were hit by the competitive crisis that almost ended them for good. We have to set the scene for the mid-1980s. The competitive nightmare, which people forget about now. This Reebok surge.
This is such a critical piece of history that just gets minimized. For a brief, but for Nike, a terrifying period, Nike was not the undisputed king. By the mid-80s, Reebok, which started as this small British running shoe company, briefly overtook Nike as the #1 athletics brand in the world.
And this wasn't some slow incremental shift. It was a seismic jolt, and it was largely driven by one massive cultural trend that Nike completely missed.
The aerobics explosion.
The explosive popularity of aerobics and fitness classes, particularly among women.
Right. Nike was laser focused on male runners, male basketball players, the traditional sports verticals. They had completely overlooked this massive demographic white space.
And Paul Fireman, the guy who took over Reebok's U.S. distribution, he saw that opportunity and created the Freestyle shoe.
The Freestyle.
Yeah.
It was made with this incredibly soft, supple garment leather. It was designed specifically for women in this booming aerobics market. It was colorful, comfortable, and most importantly, it was culturally relevant to that exact moment.
And the growth was just unbelievable.
The sales figures we have are stark. In 1989, Reebok sales hit $1.82 billion. Nike's were $1.71 billion. Reebok had seized the market lead through a category Nike was completely blind to.
I just find that fascinating, that Nike, a company founded on disruption, on seeing opportunities where others didn't, was, as the sources say, caught completely off guard by a domestic competitor.
It was a profound organizational trauma. Former Nike executives said that Phil Knight was infuriated and just deeply embarrassed. It was a failure of imagination, not just execution. The competitor didn't beat them on the track. They went around them by finding a totally new category.
And the sources say this failure, this setback, led Knight to call all his key employees together. And the new mandate was this relentless pursuit of regaining the top spot and, maybe more importantly, an organizational commitment to never get complacent again.
The Reebok surge was a crucible for them. If the early decades build resilience, this moment instilled a kind of permanent aggressive paranoia. It forced Nike to look beyond just the product and into what we are calling that outcomes of outcomes philosophy.
Right. Moving from selling shoes to selling an identity.
Exactly.
So let's define that strategy now. We've used the term outcomes of outcomes a few times. How does this mindset really distinguish Nike's decision-making from, standard quarterly planning?
It's about vision. It means you're considering the consequences of your decisions far beyond the immediate measurable metrics, beyond the quarterly revenue bump or hitting some KPI. It's a holistic view. It ensures that success in one area creates this durable, non-replicable brand asset that then drives success in future areas.
So it's not just, we hired Michael Jordan and hey, sales went up this quarter.
No.
The thinking is more like, we signed Jordan, and that single decision fundamentally redefines our brand as this high-risk, rule-breaking, aspirational identity. And the ripple effect of that one act can inspire brand activism, supply chain strategy, product innovation 30 years down the road.
That's the key, focusing on the second, third, and fourth order effects. And we also see this approach in Phil Knight's leadership style, which really enabled this kind of big-picture, risky thinking.
He wasn't a micromanager.
Far from it. He valued passion and ability above everything else, and he just trusted his team to find creative solutions. His philosophy was almost radical for big corporation. He said, don't tell people how to do things, tell them what to do, and let them surprise you with their results.
So he trusted that if he hired passionate people, their output would create those long-term ripple effects.
Yes, and nothing embodies that philosophy, or maybe accidentally defined it, more than the famous slogan itself, just do it. This is where the creative team took a massive, unforeseen risk and created a profound cultural artifact.
Okay, the invention of Just Do It in 1988. It's one of the most studied origin stories in marketing. It came from Dan Wheaton, co-founder of the Wheaton and Kennedy Agency.
Right, and he was trying to persuade Phil Knight, who was famously resistant to big ad spends, that they needed this unified, powerful campaign to fight back against Reebok.
And this is where the risk and that surprise Knight encouraged really comes into play. Whedon's mind apparently drifted to this specific, very dark anecdote from his youth.
He was thinking of a Portland native named Gary Gilmore, the infamous executed murderer. When Gilmore was asked for his last words before facing a firing squad in 1977, he was the first person executed in the U.S. after the death penalty was reinstated. He reportedly just said, "Let's do it."
Which is just an acceptance of his fate, a stoic or maybe cynical embrace of the end.
But Whedon, with his advertiser's instinct, he saw something in Gilmore's laconic embrace of the rifles, a kind of ultimate strength of will. So he adapted the phrase. He didn't like the communal "let's do it," so he changed it to the individual imperative, "just do it."
And our sources note that Knight, when he heard the slogan and its unsettling origin, he did not see the appeal at all.
It was an enormous risk, built on this macabre foundation. But Whedon told him basically, look, you hired us to surprise you. Just trust me on this one.
And the slogan, despite its origins in violence, was immediately used to inspire this virtuous exertion of willpower, overcoming sloth, achieving transcendence through sports.
So how does a three-word phrase manage to bridge that gap? From a condemned man's last words to the aspirational goal of millions of joggers.
The key, according to rhetorical analysis, is the power of the indefinite pronoun, it.
The word "it" presents a conspicuous gap, right? A blank space that you, the consumer, fill with your own personal meaning, your challenge, your desired act. And Nike, through all the visuals and the music of its ads, steers you toward acts of health, self-improvement, and virtue.
It's so effective because it gives the consumer a feeling of agency. The company isn't defining the task, you are.
And you can see the brilliance of this when you contrast it with another famous slogan that uses a conspicuous gap. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Right.
In that slogan, consumers fill in what happens with naughty, maybe embarrassing, impulsive acts, the exact opposite of the virtuous exertion Nike wants you to think of.
That's a great example. Defining the desired outcome through context, even when the phrase itself is vague.
And then there's this powerful underlying anti-intellectual strain in the phrase. The simple adverb "just" insists on immediate action. It kind of scorns reflection. It values man-doing over man-thinking.
And that cultural thread is so deeply rooted in American identity, isn't it? The idea that right actions are self-evident, they just require determination, not constant analysis.
It aligns Nike with this deep American cultural structure that elevates the pioneer, the doer, and sees doubt as a waste of time. Just do it is a demand for spontaneity, a focus on presence.
And you can link this all the way back to an ancient structure. The Latin imperative carpe diem, seize the day.
Just do it is presented in the sources as a witty and perfectly defensible contemporary translation of Horace's ancient ode. It embraces spontaneity, presence, embracing the moment, which you see all the time in extreme sports. Take the plunge for the rush.
So Nike is tapping into these deep, enduring currents of human thought, spontaneity, self-empowerment, action, and just successfully packaging it with a piece of merchandise.
Yes, but the analysis notes that Nike's management is very deliberate about excluding a huge part of the original carpe diem, the hedonistic element. Horace's original philosophy included pleasure, seduction. Nike manages the just do it context to exclude eros.
And the sources suggest three practical reasons for this. One, the traditional focus of athletic achievement often stood in opposition to physical acts of lovemaking, which were thought to deplete the body.
Right. Two, it aligns more closely with the American work ethic, which sees sacrifice as virtuous. And maybe most practically, three, eros demands no Nike equipment.
Right. The pursuit of simple pleasure doesn't require a $200 shoe. Nike sells the tools for the disciplined, challenging act of self-improvement.
But regardless of its origins, the slogan became this brilliant, highly curated philosophical tool. But it's quintessentially American optimism came into question when you factor in, the labor conditions we'll get to later.
Absolutely. That tension in the slogan, the motivational ideal versus the messy reality of global commerce, that's the core tension of the entire brand. But before we get to the ethical challenges, let's look at how their strategy created cultural penetration, starting with the Air Jordan catalyst.
The 1984 signing of Michael Jordan wasn't just a high-profile endorsement. It was one of the greatest gambles in corporate history.
Especially given the competitive landscape at the time.
Nike poured basically all its available resources into one athlete, Michael Jordan, who was an untested rookie. They did this against the advice of industry giants. Converse controlled 54% of the market, Adidas had 29%, Nike was a distant third with just 17.
And Jordan himself, he wanted to sign with Converse or Adidas. It took this massive effort from Nike executive Sonny Vaccaro to bring him on board.
Vaccaro was the visionary. He realized the goal wasn't just to sell shoes with Jordan's name on them. It was to build a permanent, standalone sub-brand that would transcend the sport itself. This was the first massive application of the outcomes of outcomes philosophy. Huge risk for a monumental, lasting reward.
And this is where the rule-breaking really cemented the brand's image as defiant. When the NBA fined Jordan $5,000 per game for wearing the original Air Jordans, saying they were too colorful.
Right. They violated the league's uniform rule.
Nike made a strategic decision.
They didn't back down. They immediately covered the fines and told Jordan to keep wearing the shoes. And that decision was just brilliant. It turned the brand into an instant symbol of rebellion. Nike and Jordan were the rule breakers against the conservative league establishment.
The fines were basically free publicity. The shoes became seen as dangerous, coveted, anti-establishment. The ripple effect was incredible. The brand authenticated its core message of pushing limits.
And the long-term consequence of that one bold move is the $3.6 billion Jordan brand, a cultural icon that, almost 4 decades later, is still thriving.
And the way Nike manages that brand is a masterclass in strategic scarcity, which is in sharp contrast to the failures of Reebok's approach.
This distinction is so crucial. Nike built the Jordan brand by being dogmatic about keeping supply just behind demand. They operate on a pull model, focusing on desirability. They're constantly selling out, refusing to fully meet the enormous demand.
Which cultivates mystique, a sense of exclusivity, a cult following. Consumers know they have to hustle to get the product, which reinforces its value.
Precisely. Now contrast that with Reebok in the early 2000s, when they tried to capture the urban music-driven market with high-profile artist collabs like the S. Carter with Jay-Z and the G-Unit line with 50 Cent.
Those were innovative moves at the time. Reebok was one of the first major brands to really do that successfully.
They were pioneers, but they misunderstood the fundamental principle of mystique. When the S. Carter shoe became a hit, Reebok switched to a push model. They prioritized volume. The sources say they went from making 5,000 pairs to eventually deciding to make 500,000 pairs.
500,000, that's a saturation strategy, not a scarcity strategy.
And the outcome of that consequence was disastrous for the brand. They completely ruined the exclusivity. That product, once so coveted, it ended up on sale at TJ Maxx for $19.99.
Ouch. The visual of a hyped celebrity shoe in a clearance bin is just the death knell for brand mystique. It makes the brand feel transactional.
Exactly. Nike, by refusing to meet demand, ensured their products stayed culturally significant and valuable at full price. Reebok, by flooding the market, made their products seem disposable. That strategic difference alone explains a huge part of Nike's long-term victory.
So moving forward a few decades, Nike's willingness to take these strategic risks, the key lesson from the Jordan fines, it all culminated in the 2018 Kaepernick strategy, perhaps their boldest move ever.
This was a massive pivot. Nike chose to feature controversial ex-NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who'd been exiled from the league for kneeling during the anthem to protest racial injustice. The campaign slogan, "Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything." And then, of course,
just do it.
Right.
The genius, or maybe the audacity of this, is that Nike itself performed the very bold act described in the slogan. They took a side in a highly polarized political debate, putting their reputation on the line, and that authenticated their brand message as truly standing for courage.
The immediate reaction was seismic. Social media was on fire, people were burning shoes, politicians called for boycotts.
But the business results spoke volumes about Nike's deep understanding of their target demographic. Post-Kaepernick, Nike profits went up worldwide, and global sales increased by 31%.
The detailed polling data is where the true brilliance of their calculation becomes apparent. Initially, most people focused on the overall inspirational message, the dream big, motivational aspect, which just overwhelmingly outperformed advertising norms.
But the politics were definitely there, and the polling showed the depth of the division it created.
It did. Democrats loved the ad more than Republicans, 80% versus 59% positive. Republicans found it much more exploitative and unethical.
So you have to ask, wasn't there huge internal pushback on risking the alienation of, almost 40% of your market? That seems like a massive risk for a global brand.
That's the core of the managed risk. The polling revealed that the deepest resonance was in communities Nike wanted to capture for the future. Black Americans, for example, loved the ad most, at 86%, and found it highly relatable for people like me.
Which aligns perfectly with their long-term goal of building community around progressive values.
And the most crucial finding for the bottom line. Even among the people whose perception of Nike got worse, only about a third of them actually said they would stop buying Nike products.
So most of the people who disliked the ad were still going to buy the shoes.
Exactly. The product habit and brand loyalty outweighed the political objections for most. It suggested that for brands willing to take calculated risks, the alienation is marginal, but the connection with your core, engaged, and often younger audience is dramatically amplified. It's a net positive in cultural equity.
Beyond the marketing genius, Nike has also just aggressively pursued dominance through relentless product innovation, and this leads us directly to the Vaporfly controversy and the whole question of fair technology.
The Vaporfly came out of Nike's high-profile 2017 Breaking 2 project, which was this ambitious attempt to get the marathon world record under 2 hours.
They narrowly missed it in the first attempt, but the shoe itself was a revelation. The name even advertised the advantage, the Vaporfly 4%.
And yes, peer-reviewed studies confirmed that claim among highly trained runners. The shoe demonstrably lowered the energetic cost of running by about 4% over competitors' shoes. A 4% advantage in endurance running it's transformative.
For a 3-hour marathoner, that's almost 8 minutes off your time just from your shoes. For an elite, it meant the 2-hour barrier, once considered mythic, was suddenly reachable.
And of course, in late 2019, Eliud Kipchoge, wearing the AlphaFly prototype, a further iteration, he achieved the sub-2-hour marathon.
So what was the biomechanical mechanism? It wasn't just soft foam, was it?
No. The advantage comes from a complex interaction. The superior energy return from the novel React foam interacting with the lever-like effects of the carbon fiber plate.
So the plate isn't just a stiffener.
It acts as a lever. It stiffens the joint where your toes meet the rest of your foot. And this stiffness changes your biomechanics, saving energy during the toe-off phase. The shoe didn't just cushion, it changed the internal economy of your running stride.
The advantage became visible everywhere. Data from Strava showed runners in Vaporflies were running 2 to 3% faster, and by 2019, 41% of all sub-3-hour marathoners were wearing them.
This unprecedented dominance forced World Athletics, the sport's governing body, to intervene. They had to redefine the line between human effort and tech assistance. On January 31st, 2020, they amended their rules.
What were the specific guardrails they set?
2 main rules. First, the sole thickness was capped at 40 millimeters. Second, to prevent stacking tech, the shoe couldn't have more than one rigid embedded plate.
So did Nike's innovation get banned outright?
It was a strategic compromise. World Athletics allowed the current, publicly available Vaporfly models to stay legal, but it effectively banned the more extreme AlphaFly prototype Kipchoge wore, which was suspected of pushing past the new limits.
And the distinction they made is key to the future of tech regulation. Why was the Vaporfly deemed fair compared to, say, the banned Speedo swimsuits?
This is a critical legal and technological distinction. They differentiated between technology that interacts with the runner's internal biomechanics versus tech that alters the external environment. The Vaporfly's improvement came from the interaction of the sole with the runner's internal mechanics.
Whereas the banned equipment conferred an external advantage.
Exactly. The Speedo LZR Racer swimsuit, it trapped air, increased buoyancy, reduced drag. It literally made swimming easier by changing the environment. The Vaporfly improved the internal economy of the runner, and World Athletics drew the line there.
That ruling essentially used the current level of Nike innovation as the new benchmark, but it established firm guardrails, the 40mm and single-plate rules, to prevent shoes from becoming purely mechanical aids.
They also added a fairness rule. Any shoe used in competition has to be available for purchase on the open market for at least 4 months. This stops elite athletes from using secret, customized prototypes the public can't access.
So Nike pushed innovation so far. It literally changed the international rules of the sport. But their global scale also put them at the center of the greatest ethical challenge they ever faced, the 1990s sweatshop crisis.
This is the crucial counterpoint to the entire aspirational just-do-it philosophy, the grim reality of their global supply chain. In the 90s, Nike became the poster child for exploitative labor practices, primarily in Southeast Asia. Factories like the Taekwon Vina factory in Vietnam became infamous.
What were the specific details of the conditions that activists uncovered?
The abuses were extensive and well documented. We're talking tens of thousands of workers in Vietnam alone, mostly young women from rural areas earning incredibly low wages, around $40 a month. This was not a living wage. It forced workers into a cycle of debt.
And the hours were relentless.
Yes, they were forced to work over legal overtime limits almost every day. The factory environment was also physically hazardous. All these toxic solvents and glues in manufacturing. They caused severe respiratory ailments, dizziness, nausea.
And there were allegations of managerial abuse.
Absolutely. Reports of verbal harassment, physical abuse, a complete lack of independent unions. The sources detail one instance where women were forced by supervisors to kneel with their hands up for 25 minutes as punishment for minor mistakes.
And this is where that bitter irony of just do it was most keenly felt. Labor activist Jeffrey Ballinger pointed out the cruel cynicism of asking consumers to pay $130 for shoes made by a workers' force to just do what you are told.
Initially, Nike's response was denial. They claimed they weren't responsible since they didn't own the factories, they just subcontracted the work. This was a public relations catastrophe. It just worsened the crisis, led to widespread protests, boycotts on college campuses.
So what drove the eventual corporate social responsibility, the CSR turnaround? Was it a sudden change of heart?
It was intense, organized, external pressure. NGO networks like Vietnam Labor Watch were incredibly effective. They used prepaid calling cards to get info from workers, leaked internal audit results, and mobilized global media. The reputational damage became so severe that change was inevitable.
It forced a massive strategic shift.
It did. Then CEO Phil Knight gave a landmark speech in 1998, famously admitting that the Nike product had become synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse. That public acknowledgement was the crucial turning point. They shifted from denial to commitment.
What were the key tangible reforms they implemented that actually raised the bar for the industry?
They implemented several industry-leading changes. First, they aggressively addressed the hazardous conditions. They committed to ending toxic solvents, moving to 95% water-based adhesives by 2001. That alone significantly reduced respiratory ailments.
And they changed the standard of corporate transparency.
Yes, radically. They became the first in the apparel industry to publish a full list of all their contract factories, what we now call Transparency 101. This was revolutionary because it allowed external auditors and NGOs to verify conditions independently.
Which put serious pressure on competitors like Adidas and Puma to follow suit.
Absolutely. They implemented their own extensive code of conduct, partnered with external NGOs for monitoring. The lesson here is profound. CSR can emerge from crisis, transforming a disaster into industry-shaping leadership by establishing a new, higher standard of accountability for the entire supply chain.
So we've traced the history, the strategy, the cultural impact, the necessary reforms. What does the modern competitive dynamic look like now? What's the future outlook for the company that vowed to never grow complacent?
Well, Nike's continued success is attributed by analysts to that relentless internal mandate, the refusal to take a deep breath. Their machine is focused inward, constantly innovating and staying ahead of consumer demand, maintaining that aggressive paranoia instilled by the Reebok surge.
But the very ubiquity and scale that Nike has achieved, their sheer dominance, that has to create an opening for competitors.
That's the critical vulnerability. Former Reebok executives argue that when a brand becomes ubiquitous, when everyone has it, the consumer eventually looks for something new, something that represents originality.
Paul Fireman, former CEO of Reebok, used a fantastic analogy. He said, you can't challenge General Motors or Ford by building a slightly better Ford. You have to challenge them with a Tesla, a completely new kind of product.
Which means if a challenger is going to return to relevance, they have to avoid going head-to-head with Nike. It's just too costly. Instead, they must go around creating new categories or radical innovations that Nike hasn't captured yet.
And finally, let's revisit the Vaporfly controversy. The ultimate consequence of that technological disruption is an inflection point for the sport of athletics itself.
The Vaporfly and the massive sponsored projects that created it, Breaking 2 in EOS 1.59, have fundamentally changed the economic landscape of elite distance running. These projects attracted unprecedented funding from major corporations with no historical interest in athletics governance.
In other words, the money poured into the technology created a new financial floor for the sport.
Exactly. If technological advancement continues at this pace, and if world records keep being set in this highly funded, sponsored environment, we are moving toward a professional sporting landscape that looks a lot more like Formula One or other heavily funded professional sports.
A sport where massive corporate R&D budgets drive performance and redefine what's physically possible, forcing the governing bodies to just constantly play regulatory catch-up.
The governing body is now in a perpetual reactive state, constantly redefining that ethical line between human effort and equipment advantage, and that cycle is not going to slow down.
So let's bring this full circle. We started with Phil Knight's obscure MBA idea about Japanese shoes in the trunk of his car, and we've tracked it into a brand that successfully weaves together high-risk marketing, relentless product innovation, and this carefully crafted philosophy of self-empowerment.
We've seen how Nike used existential adversity, the near bankruptcy, the shock of the Reebok surge, the political fallout of Kaepernick, to fuel and sharpen its core brand identity.
And crucially, we've seen how they transform their greatest ethical challenge, the sweatshop crisis, into an industry-leading standard for corporate social responsibility, turning a reputational disaster into a long-term strategic advantage.
The Nike brand remains this powerful global engine, but it's one fueled by that enduring tension between the just-do-it optimism, the command for self-transcendence, and the complex, messy realities of global commerce, activism, and technology that surround it.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider, based on Phil Knight's long history of learning from failure and the current challenges of scale. Consider his quote, "Beating the competition is relatively easy. Beating yourself is a never-ending commitment."
So given Nike's history of massive internal change, the CSR reforms, embracing radical marketing risk, the constant innovation drive, the question for you to ponder is, what internal commitment, beyond just avoiding complacency, must Nike make next to ensure it remains culturally relevant?
How does the company that succeeded by constantly taking risks now avoid the monotony that comes with being the undisputed global leader? What is the next internal battle against the self?
That is the definitive final layer of analysis to the WhyItTV Nike series. We appreciate you diving deep with us.